Welcome to a new episode of Israelpodden. And I want to say welcome to Jotam Confino, our guest. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Pio.
You are a journalist from Denmark. I did check your LinkedIn to see all these different newspapers where you have worked. It's quite a list.
Yes, I've been here since 2018, decided to move from Denmark to Israel because I could not get a job in the Danish media world because I don't come from a journalist school. I have an academic background. And in Denmark, they're very rigid about how you become a journalist. It's very, very difficult to enter the media world if you don't go to journalist school. And I only realized that very late. But eventually, I decided to move to Israel to give it one last shot to become a journalist. And in Israel, like many other countries, you don't need to have a diploma from a journalist school to become a journalist. In fact, they actually like that you have a different kind of background, especially if you're diving into something as difficult and complex as the Middle East, because it's extremely difficult to understand the dynamics and the history and the religion if you haven't read up on it. So I got a job 2 weeks after I landed here at an English-speaking TV station called I-24 News, and then my journey began as a journalist. And since then, I've worked for many different media. I had a couple of years where I was a news editor at Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, and then after that, I began a freelance career working for mainly British and American newspapers and TV channels. And that's basically what I've been doing since. It's a hard way to be a journalist when you're doing freelance stuff because you need a variety of clients in order for you to make enough money, because Israel is an expensive country to live in, but also in certain periods, the demand is not so high. Now, luckily, it's the only thing that's been good about the war as a journalist is that you never run out of work. So I've had a tremendous amount of work to dive into, both in print and radio and TV. And even though there's a ceasefire now, reportedly on paper, there is a ceasefire in place, I still have a lot of work. So I work mainly for the British newspapers and their TV and radio channels. And I also do quite a lot for American media.
Okay, so you are a freelancer and you have all these different papers. Like I can mention someone here, like CBS News, BBC, Sky News, USA Today, The Telegraph, The Sun, Daily Mail, Berlinske Tidene. So you have all these as clients at the same time, and then you kind of sell your story. Is that how it works?
It's yes and no. So some of these I don't work with anymore. USA Today, for example, I was a freelancer with them for a couple of years, and then I switched to another paper. So sometimes it really depends on the situation and the demand. I can't have, let's say, 30 clients at the same time. That's just not possible. But I can juggle between 10 and 15 different clients. It's very hard, but it's possible. It just means that you need to be available from the early morning hours to the late evening hours. And it works in the way that they require my work on the ground. It's not so much that I sell them stories, it's more that they come to me and ask me to cover certain things, especially radio and TV. So the story of the day, for example, if there's a terrorist attack or if there's some development in the ceasefire, they call me and to ask me, can you be with us in 2 hours, for example? And you need to be flexible because you can't say, well, I only work from 8 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon. Then you're going to miss out on most of those clients because a lot of them have shows both in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening. So in order for you to have this kind of living, you need to be 150% invested in prioritizing your clients. I can't count how many times I've been somewhere and then someone called and I had to leave a social gathering or I was out doing some grocery shopping or whatever. But again, I really like it because it means that I can work for many different outlets. So for example, CBS News, I was with them for a year and a half doing radio reporting for them. I'm not with them anymore. Currently, my main clients are the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, the New York Sun, the BBC, Times Radio, LBC Radio, and of course also my Danish client, which is BT. It's basically the only Danish media that still wants to work with me, and I have a contract with them, so I'm their person on the ground here.
So, what type of topics is it that you cover more? Like, is it all of the full life of living in Israel, the people, the politics, the culture, or is it more related to the conflict?
I would say, unfortunately, it's mostly defense and politics because it's usually sad stories that the media want to cover. You
Yeah.
can be obviously a culture correspondent, but there isn't that much demand for culture stories, even though Israel is a plethora of culture and there are so many interesting stories you could dive into. So unless you have a lot of money in your bank account and unless you have a really good client who can pay you a salary and you do a couple of stories a month about culture, you have to cover politics and defense because those two things are that's what people want to hear about. They want to hear about the war, they want to hear about the conflict, they want to hear about elections. And in Israel, we've had endless elections since I moved in 2018. So it's mainly politics and defense that I cover. And in the past couple of years, it's been war, unrest inside Israel because of the judicial reforms, demonstrations, and elections. That's been basically the main things that I've covered. But I also cover other things that aren't just coming out of Israel. So it could be what's happening in Syria or in Lebanon, Iran. Of course, to me, it's hard to cover some of those countries because I'm half Israeli, so I can't go to Iran, I can't go to Lebanon, I can't go to Syria. So it's hard for me to cover what's happening there, but I can cover it in relation to what's happening between that country and Israel, which is usually what I do. There's a dynamic between Israel and all of those countries, so I cover the conflict between Israel and those countries.
Okay, there you answered two questions I had actually, because your name, Jotam, is that Jewish? Jewish?
It's a Hebrew name, yeah. It's from the
Yeah,
Bible. Yotam is actually the way you pronounce it. In
Jotam.
English, it's Yotam, yeah. So it depends on how you pronounce it. But yeah, it's an Israeli name. I was born in Israel, but I grew up in Denmark. I lived the first 27 years of my life in Denmark, and then I lived here the past 7 years. So that's why, my upbringing and my person is more Danish than it is Israeli, because
Mm.
27 years of your life is, after all, that's the years where you develop and you become a person.
Mm. Yeah, that's true. It is. But it is good that you know about the politics and about defense and the conflict, because that is the questions I have for you today.
Yeah,
So
great.
I want to start off with something like a recent poll that came out. It says that 70% of the Israeli population don't support Netanyahu anymore, and they want him to resign. And since you have this understanding of the people and the politics, why do you think this is?
I would say Netanyahu has been quite unpopular for a while. It's been very difficult for him to get a majority in the elections, which is why we saw 5 elections in the past 7 years. And eventually he lost. In 2021, he was replaced. So he's someone who has been able to make two comebacks in Israel, which is quite extraordinary. He's the only person to be able to do that in such a powerful way and to dominate Israeli politics for so many years. But he is also a prime minister or a politician who uses Machiavellian methods to come to power. He's very cynical. He does not really have an ideology anymore. He's willing to sell to whoever wants to buy his goods. It doesn't matter if he needs to sit with the religious parties or the centrist parties, he will sit with whoever. But the thing is that Netanyahu has made so many enemies over the years. He has thrown so many of his partners under the bus and destroyed many of their political careers. So he's left with a relatively small number of parties in Israel who want to sit with him. Now, the reason why he's so unpopular is mainly because of the situation here. Most people hold Netanyahu accountable for what happened on October the 7th, even though he is the one who has been the least willing to take responsibility. The chief of staff, the IDF chief of staff, has many times taken full responsibility. In fact, he even resigned. And there's a new IDF chief now. The Mossad chief, the Shin Bet chief, all of them have taken full responsibility. The closest Netanyahu has come to taking responsibility is to say that he's sorry about the situation that the families are in. So Netanyahu is doing everything he can to avoid taking responsibility. And that's something that most Israelis do not accept. Because when you're the head of state and the biggest disaster in the history of the country takes place, you are, by definition, responsible. Many other prime ministers have also taken responsibility for horrible things that happen. I think the best example is probably Golda Meir when the Yom Kippur War erupted. Obviously, she won a re-election, but she ended up, stepping down because she was very unpopular. Half the country didn't like her. There are many examples of that, but Netanyahu is a different figure, and I think most Israelis realize that he puts his own political interest above the country's. And that's clearly something that the majority won't accept. Now, that being said, he still, on paper, has a majority coalition. He can go on being in power until 2026, and a lot can happen in that time. So just because 70% of Israelis say now that they would like for him to step down, it doesn't mean that a year from now you'll see the same figures. A lot can happen, and Israelis tend to forget things. I don't think they'll forget October 7th, but they tend to forget and like sometimes even forgive politicians for something they did. So he's going to do everything he can now to get as many accomplishments as possible to show the Israeli people in the coming year until there's elections so that he can once again be re-elected. But I do believe that his time is very close to end. I don't think we'll see Netanyahu in power for much longer.
Like you said, like other leaders have taken responsibility, like the IDF leader resigned, Finkelman. You said the Mossad, Shin Bet have also taken responsibility. Have the leaders of those also resigned?
Not yet. And it's a good question, really, because a lot of people would like to see them resign. There's a ceasefire now, so it's a pretty good time to do that, to change the guard. The Shin Bet chief has said, well, as long as the hostages are still in Gaza, it's my responsibility to get them out, and I'm not going to resign. And that's something that has angered Netanyahu because he would like to replace him with somebody that he trusts more. Those two have been clashing many times in the past. So he would like to replace him. He would also like to replace the Mossad chief at the first chance. So you could definitely argue that the head of the Mossad and the head of the Shin Bet should resign. It's just as much their responsibility that this happened. You could argue maybe in some ways more, especially when it comes to gathering intelligence and defense. Now, Netanyahu is in charge of making the decisions. So ultimately, he is responsible, but he has people around him who give him the intelligence. And sometimes he listens to them and sometimes he doesn't. But essentially, none of them predicted a full invasion of Gaza into Israel. They said that things were happening. Hamas was preparing for attacks and stuff, but none of them predicted a October 7th type attack. So I think that's why a lot of Israelis would like to see them resign.
Since Israel is a democratic country, is many different opinions of every topic, isn't it like a saying that for every two Jews there are three opinions? Yeah. So when you travel around, you talk with your fellow Israelis. What is the vibe, the feeling of how the current administration have handled the hostage situation?
There's
Dealing with
immense
Hamas.
frustration. There's a lot of frustration for a few reasons. Netanyahu very early on decided to come up with a slogan called Total Victory: the destruction of Hamas and the return of all hostages. I think every sane Israeli knew that's impossible. They hold the hostages, they have power. You are not going to be able to return all of them alive, that's for sure, but return all of them and at the same time crush them. It's not possible. So already at the beginning, people understood that he's now already playing politics and talking in slogans. So there's obviously a huge part of the Israelis who would like to do pretty much anything to get the hostages back. In fact, they are okay with prolonging the ceasefire with Hamas, which means that Hamas will de facto continue to rule Gaza. As long as the hostages get out, they're okay with it. They're not happy with it, but they're okay with it. And because Netanyahu is now not engaging in the way that he's supposed to, they were supposed to enter the second phase of the ceasefire, which hasn't happened, which means that it's stalled now. The hostages are in tremendous danger in tunnels inside Gaza. And they could have been out if Netanyahu had said, let's continue phase two. We will withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor as was stipulated in the agreement, which means we're removing our forces from the buffer zone separating Gaza from Israel, and we'll remove our forces totally. Now that was the plan. But Netanyahu realized that once the ceasefire was in place, the Hamas military was not fully destroyed as the IDF said it was. In fact, it's still very much in power, not in the same way, of course, but it is in power. So a lot of Israelis feel like he's right now wasting time, and that time is so precious because every day that passes is a huge risk to the lives of the hostages. So they are very frustrated. They demonstrate not, you don't have 100,000 people on the street, but you have thousands still on almost like a daily basis going out. And then you have a different segment in society. That's usually the more right-wing nationalist religious people who are looking at this in a completely different way. They are actually pressuring Netanyahu into continue the war because according to them, it's more dangerous to allow Hamas to be in power and to continue the ceasefire, to get the hostages out, because that means that you are continuing to free thousands of Palestinian prisoners, many of whom are horrifically violent, have killed many civilians, and they say you're just buying time, and eventually these terrorists are going to come back to kill you. So instead of freeing 59 people where only 24 are alive, we should continue to crush Hamas because that is the best way to keep Israel safe. So you definitely have two camps in Israel, and then you have people obviously who are in gray zones and in between, but it's very much those two segments and those two narratives that you hear when you speak to people.
It seems like from the beginning that Netanyahu, he said that Hamas will never be able to operate again in Gaza, and we will never, like, we won't retreat our forces until this have happened. We don't want you to restock your ammunition, regroup, and grow again. This cannot happen. So when I saw this phase two part of the ceasefire, I never believed this was actually going to happen. But what you say here is that maybe the majority, they care more about the lives of the hostages than the possibility of Hamas rebuilding. So he have a different perspective than the majority. Is that correct?
That is correct. He is very much worried that some of his hardline coalition partners are going to leave the government if he enters phase two of the ceasefire, because they've threatened with doing so. And if they do, he doesn't have a majority anymore, and they could topple him, which means he'll have to call elections at a time where he's nowhere near being able to form or to win the next election, according to the polls. And that would probably be the end of Netanyahu's career, because if there's a new government in place that lasts for 4 years, Netanyahu is going to be 78 or 79 years old next time there's an election. He's already, physically, he's in a relatively good shape considering how old he is, how much pressure he's on. He's under insane pressure every single day. But he has health issues. He's got his heart, he's got issues with it. Generally, he's not obviously someone that I think at the age of 79, if you look at him now, would be able to make another comeback. I think that's quite unrealistic. So that's why right now he's doing everything he can to keep his coalition partners happy. And if he can stall for time, if he can keep the status quo and somehow drag on the ceasefire process without making a real decision, he will do that. But eventually he needs to make a decision, because you can't continue to have a ceasefire in place where you don't get any of the benefits. Right now, Hamas is getting the benefits of the ceasefire because it's not being bombarded from morning till evening. There are certain airstrikes targeting Hamas members or Islamic Jihad members who come too close to the fence or who pose a threat to the IDF. But generally, Hamas is enjoying peace and quiet without having to release any of the hostages. There is a consequence, of course, to this, because Israel has stopped all aid coming in and cut off the electricity that Israel provides to one of the places for water distillation, for example, which is something that Gaza is going to feel very soon. But Hamas will be the last to feel this. The civilians are always the first to feel it because Hamas is stealing the aid and they are storing diesel and fuel for whenever the war might resume.
That is true. I just want to say about Netanyahu and the pressure. I would not want to be in his shoes. It seems like he gets criticized no matter what he do. It's like an impossible situation for the leader of Israel to know where to navigate.
Grateful task. It's an ungrateful task, no matter what, and especially as the prime minister of a country that's being criticized. Everything they do is being criticized. Even their allies are criticizing most of the things they do. And then you have all of the people who would like to kill you. It's an impossible situation, but somehow he's managing, and I honestly don't know why or how.
Are Jews or Israelites, do they have like hard skin for criticism? Because what I've learned, I've not been to Israel, but I've heard that you are very open about your opinions, and you challenge others' opinion, and you're not shy to criticize in this. So maybe you grow a little hard skin.
Absolutely. I think for you to be in Israeli politics, you have to be very mentally strong, you have to be ready to fight tooth and nail, and you have to be able to take criticism, which often is extremely hard. It's not the same as in Norway or Denmark, where you have some sort of like a way that you speak to each other. You don't yell at each other. There are certain things, it's a certain respectful tone that sometimes is completely lacking in Israel.
I wanted to ask you a little bit, like this is going to be a little different episode of the podcast, because you are you are familiar with the Israeli political system, and for us in the Scandinavia, I don't know how much we know about this. So I was hoping you could unpack this a little for us and educate us a little. What is the major differences between the far left and far right? And then I thought maybe we can use Netanyahu's party and we can work our way from there. So I have this graphic here we can use. Let's see.
Mhm.
I don't know if you see this because you're on your phone.
Yeah, I see it.
Yeah. So we can start with the Likud. This is the Netanyahu's party, right? And his party is in the center.
I wouldn't say that. It's a right-wing party. No, it's a right-wing party, and it's become increasingly right-wing over the years, especially under Netanyahu. Likud was basically established by Menachem Begin, and became the first party to be a right-wing party in power in Israel. And it's a liberal right-wing party. It believes in capitalism. It believes in a strong Israeli defense against the Palestinians. It believes in the settlements, but it's not a religious party, for example. And it does believe, at least the original Likud believed in a liberal political system where you have a strong Supreme Court, you have obviously the parliament, and you have you have what we have in Scandinavia, where you divide the powers between three different institutions. But Likud has changed very much under Netanyahu in recent years, especially the whole view on the Supreme Court, which is quite a liberal value to believe in a strong Supreme Court. Likud under Netanyahu has basically launched a war on the Supreme Court. They believe that the Supreme Court is too powerful. They want to take a lot of that power and put it in the hands of the government instead. And it also believes, at the moment, many in Likud believe that annexing the West Bank would be a good idea. So it's becoming a different party, and it's becoming quite populistic. And also it's centered very much around Netanyahu. Like, he is the party. And then you have other parties who are also right-wing, who kind of have the same policy as Netanyahu's Likud party. They don't differ that much, actually. For example, if you take the National Unity Party, which has, as you see here, 14 seats. The National Unity Party is led by Benny Gantz, who is defense minister in Netanyahu's government. And or he was in the war cabinet, and generally he's a military guy. He was the leader of the IDF. He is leading a party that on paper is not that different from Likud. The difference is that they believe in a strong Supreme Court. But other than that, it's quite similar. It's definitely a right-wing party. And you have a few of those parties that are quite alike. They're not that different. Israelpodden, for example, is also it's a more hawkish right-wing party. They are led by Avigdor Lieberman, who is of Soviet descent, and many of the people who vote for Israelpodden, they are immigrants from the former Soviet Union or Russians. So that's a party that's very right-wing when it comes to defense, for example. They would also like to see an annexation of the West Bank. They'd have very little sympathy for the Palestinians. What differs between, for example, Israelpodden and Likud and the National Unity Party is that Israelpodden has made it one of their core principles that the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel need to go to the army, they need to start working more, they need to basically take some of the burden off the secular people in society. And they are very, very aggressive with their rhetoric and with the things that they want to do. So in that sense, it's a right-wing party that is really not religious at all. And it does really not have a very good relationship with the ultra-Orthodox parties. You have other right-wing parties that that would be considered far right, for example, Jewish Home and Religious Zionism. Jewish Home is actually called Jewish Power now. So it's called Otzma Yehudit, and it's led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, who very much is a hardcore nationalist religious thug in many ways. And I'm saying that because he has been indicted, I don't know how many times. He has basically been, he's a racist straight up. He's been accused of racism and also been indicted for racism because of his statements on the Palestinians. He supported for a long time a party in Israel that was established by Meir Kahane, which basically was a terror-supporting party. It supported Jewish terrorism. And Itamar Ben-Gvir is probably one of the most controversial figures ever to enter politics, and certainly to be in the security cabinet. Now, he left Netanyahu's coalition a while ago because he was unhappy with the way that things were going with the ceasefire. So his party is religious. They believe in throwing the Palestinians out of the West Bank and Gaza, and it believes in Arab Israelis showing 100% loyalty to the Jewish state. So he's very much a type that attracts a lot of the settlers in the West Bank, but not only, also people inside Israel who are just fed up with the Palestinians. He's a type that also goes to the Temple Mount, which is forbidden according to the ultra-Orthodox people, the rabbis. They say that the Temple Mount is very sacred, so you should not go there. But Itamar Ben-Gvir is one of those people who would like to probably restore the Jewish temple.
Is this a party that have grown since the attack, 7 October? I can imagine that people who were more friendly towards the Palestinians many may have changed sides.
Yeah, absolutely. He's attracted many of the right-wing voters, especially from the Religious Zionism Party. The Religious Zionism Party is very religious. Unlike Jewish Power, its main focus is religion combined with defense. It's very much for the settlements. It wants to annex all of the West Bank. And the leader, Bezalel Smotrich, is also a very notorious person. He has some extreme statements behind him which range from homophobia to how you treat women and to generally to against the Palestinians and Arabs. And his vision is one big Israel, almost like a Jewish kingdom.
So that religious Zionism party is now barely making the electoral threshold according to the polls, because many of the voters have gone to Itamar Ben-Gvir, who they believe is a much more militant person who's ready to take on the Palestinians. So they are considered far-right parties, those two, and they are basically competing for the same votes. Then you have the Ultra-Orthodox parties, which is Shas and United Torah Judaism. And those two parties have been kingmakers for many, many years in Israeli politics because the left and the right-wing parties could never agree, or sometimes they did, but mostly the right-wing parties, led by Netanyahu and others, established coalitions with the ultra-Orthodox parties. Because the only thing that they demand is that they continue to be exempt from the military, which is something that has been in place since 1948, that the ultra-Orthodox don't have to serve in the army the same way as secular Israelis do. Number two, they demand that they can continue to study in the yeshivas and basically focus their whole lives on religious studies without having to work and still get a lot of benefits from the state, ranging from straight up unemployment benefits, but also stipends for their kindergartens and their schools. And they live in a bubble. They live in their own world. They see many of the Jews in Israel as not actual Jews, because many Jews in Israel, like me, we don't have a Jewish mother. And according to the ultra-Orthodox way of thinking, in order for you to be a Jew, your mother has to be a Jew. So it doesn't matter if you were born in Israel to a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, and you served in the army and you contributed to Israel as a Jewish state, they still don't see you as a Jew. And especially if you don't keep Shabbat and all that. So they are a very unique and very difficult segment in society, but they have managed to capitalize tremendously on their position as the kingmaker in Israel to continue to get all of the things that they want simply by backing whoever needs their votes. And in this case, it's Netanyahu that has managed to do that for years.
How have the Israeli people reacted to this suggestion that all need to serve equally? No one can have a special treatment. If I look at this like a Norwegian, I don't think this could happen. That someone are special and they risk their life when the country is attacked. Like here is like a equality philosophy. So how do they see this? Do they like this or?
No, they don't.
No.
But it's their own fault. The secular Israelis could have, a long time ago, if they wanted to, forced the ultra-Orthodox to participate on equal grounds, go to the army and work. But they haven't, because they've been more busy with fighting between the left wing and the right wing over what you should do with the Palestinians or what you should do with the economy. And in the meantime, they have just relied on their votes to be in power. So it's not just Netanyahu who sat in a coalition with them. Ehud Barak, for example, who was a left-wing prime minister, he also sat with them and he allowed them to continue to just collect unemployment benefits. The thing is that it's mind-blowing, really, because there's no country in the world that I can think of where you have a minority that has such a special status in society where they don't need to contribute and they don't need to sacrifice their sons and their daughters on the front line. They don't need to work. And still, they manage to just continue to be among the power brokers every time there's an election. It's fascinating because a lot of secular Israelis have for years been fed up with this. They are furious, especially after October 7th. If you look at how many people have been sacrificed in Gaza and in Lebanon, most of them are either secular Israelis or traditional Jews. Very few of them are ultra-Orthodox. Very, very few. So it's a completely unequal burden that the secular Jews, they bear. And that's something that for years has been a huge issue, and we've seen demonstrations against it by Israelis. But the countries that the secular Israelis vote for, and I go back to this, they just don't do anything about it. And instead of overcoming some of their difference on the Palestinians and making sure that this segment of society actually bears equal burden, they continue to fight between themselves, and then they go back to the Ultra-Orthodox for help when there's an election.
So this is not something that's about to change, because I have seen a lot of footage from the IDF. They go and these Ultra-Orthodox, they sit in protest in the highway, in the streets. And the IDF, they come and they drag them into to cars to be recruited.
They do, but they don't, in the sense that there are thousands who are supposed to have been drafted, and they get away with it because then they, cause a scene. They sit on railways or roads or whatever, and the Israeli police can only do so much. Some of them are arrested, some of them are forced to enter, but it all comes down to them having gotten away with this for decades. So they're not about to say, all right, now we're all just going to enlist, because that would be for the better of the country. They will fight tooth and nail, and they've threatened with toppling Netanyahu if he doesn't make sure that there's a law once and for all that will exempt them from army enlistment. The thing is that the Supreme Court has said over and over and asked governments for years to come up with a solution, because it goes against the sense of equality for the law. The Supreme Court has said you can't have a segment in society that's not equal to everyone else. Eventually, there will be a solution, I guess, to this. I just don't think that it's necessarily the solution that a lot of secular people want, because the Ultra-Orthodox have between 7, 8, 9, 10 children, so they grow in terms of numbers much more than the secular part of Israeli society. So eventually, decades from now, you will see a majority of Israel be Ultra-Orthodox. And if nothing changes in terms of the burden in society, Israel will no longer be able to exist in the form that it does now.
Well, you have the Ultra-Orthodox, then you have another big group who is also not serving. I think from the Arab population, you have maybe 1% is voluntary. And I believe this was because they didn't want to force people who didn't have loyalty to the country into the army. So are they also talking about this, about the Arab population in Israel?
Some are. Some parties are saying, look, the Arab Israelis have a pretty good life here compared to what they would have in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Syria, pretty much any other country in the Middle East. They have a pretty good life here. They can vote, they have good jobs, they have health care. So why should they not serve in the army? A lot of political parties are beginning to ask that question. I think for many, many years, it was like a taboo. That the War of Independence in 1948 was still fresh for all of those people, who many of them lost some of their homes and they lost the war. So it was unrealistic and unthinkable to ask the losing side in the party to join the army of the side that won the war. I think that's the thinking behind it, and of course also thinking that they would probably not be very loyal if they were even recruited. But it's changing, I think, and I think eventually, I think you're also going to see more Arab Israelis joining. You have a lot of Bedouins and Druze, the Druze minority. They join the army in much bigger numbers, and that's becoming more popular. So I think eventually there will be a more equal burden also when it comes to that part of society.
I just want to bring up this graphic one more time so we can finish our political...
a lot of parties.
What I understand from you is that because I have tried to find a good graphic presentation of the Israeli political parties, but it seems like this is not correct, that this is not the right side and this is the left side, right? It's like it's just different coalitions, but it's not what or maybe you can unpack this, if this how this is.
It's a really good question. It's something that I totally understand why this would be confusing to you, because it seems as if it's the right against the left. And that's also how Netanyahu wants to frame it. It's due to him and many of his coalition partners and voters that we consider let's say, the National Unity Party as a left-wing party, or a lot of people do, which is insane. They're not a left-wing party at all. But it's the rhetoric. It's because Netanyahu has always tried to say anyone who doesn't want to sit with me is a left-winger by definition, and that's just not true. What you're seeing here is the Netanyahu bloc and the anti-Netanyahu bloc. And in the anti-Netanyahu bloc, you have right-wing parties like Israelpodden, National Unity Party. Then you have centrist parties like Yesh Atid, for example, which is led by Yair Lapid, a former journalist. And he has also been a partner with Netanyahu. He was in his government in 2013. So it's not as if he hasn't sat with Netanyahu. He just eventually learned that Netanyahu is not somebody you can trust. And he has been one of his most vocal opponents for years. And he even managed to topple him. And he formed a new coalition with Naftali Bennett in 2021. Which was mind-blowing to many people. Naftali Bennett was the leader of the Jewish another Jewish nationalist party back then. But anyway, so Yesh Atid is a centrist party, are very much on social economics. They also, like Israelpodden, are fighting very hard for the Ultra-Orthodox to enter the workforce and the army. They would like a free market. And they are not necessarily 100% against a Palestinian state. For now, they might be, but in the long run, Yesh Atid is a party that wants to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by having an agreement with the Palestinians. Then you have Meretz, which is no longer even, they are not even on the map anymore because they didn't manage to enter the electoral threshold last time. Labour has turned into the Democratic Party now, and they are actually doing quite well in the polls. They get between 8 to 10 mandates in the polls, which is much more than Labour has gotten in many years. Basically, it's Labour just with a new package. And that's led by Yair Golan, which is a former IDF deputy chief of staff, who has been, he's not on here, I think. No, he was supposed to have been instead of Merav Michaeli, where it says Labour. But it's very confusing because things change all the time. So most of this is correct, but some of it is not. But nevertheless, I'm just going to try and unpack it anyway. So the Democratic Party is what's left of the left wing. And that is a party that's obviously socialist in terms of economics. But more importantly, it's one of the few parties that still believes in a two-state solution. And that's something that most Israelis don't believe in anymore. I think it's only 24% who believe in a two-state solution. The same goes for the Palestinians. If you ask them, it's the same kind of number, 25, 26% maybe. So Labour is a left-wing party. Meretz is also a very much left-wing party. It might be able to enter the electoral threshold in next election, but currently they're not in parliament. And then lastly, you have...
Just one question. When you say they don't believe in it, is it like they don't believe it will happen or they don't want it anymore?
Oh, good question. They don't want it. If you ask how many Israelis support a two-state solution, 24% will say they do and the rest won't. Then you have the Palestinians who say the same. Only 24, 25, 26% support a Palestinian state, which is interesting because the whole world is under the impression that all the Palestinians want is a two-state solution. No, they don't. When they yell free Palestine, they mean free Palestine. They mean kick the Jews into the ocean, get them out of here. This is what they mean. Obviously, there are some who believe, like I said, 24%, but that's far from even being close to a majority. So it's delusional to say that once there's a two-state solution, the war will be over. No, because people like Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade and all of those, they don't want a two-state solution. They want to kill every single Jew inside Israel. That's it. And then lastly, you have the Arab parties, which of course, some of them are very, very critical of the state of Israel. They believe that it's essentially an apartheid state. They feel discriminated against. They long for not only a two-state solution, but generally for the days back when it was just Palestine. That's some of the more hardcore Arab parties. Then you have a party like Ram, which is led by Mansour Abbas, And he has actually, for the first time in Israeli history, an Arab party was a part of the coalition, an Israeli coalition. That was when Naftali Bennett was in power. And that was unheard of, that an Arab party could be a support to the government. So he's much more moderate in the sense that he believes in the Jewish state, and that Arabs should obviously have equal rights and everything, and he's less critical of Israel compared to some of the other Arab parties.
I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but is it like, do Arabs only vote Arab parties?
Largely, yes. Obviously, there are some that vote for Likud even. You do have, Arabs who think that Netanyahu is actually not a bad person. He's actually made sure that the Arabs have a pretty good life in Israel. I would say that that's definitely a minority. Most Arabs do vote according to their background, which is Arab parties. So, by the way, a lot of other tribes in Israel do the same. Like I said, people from the former Soviet Union, many of them vote for Israelpodden because it's seen as a Russian immigrant party.
We can go to an end to the political, but can you say, like, what is the biggest difference between the Israeli politics and the political system and the Scandinavia?
I think the biggest difference is that you don't have religious fanatics. That is the main difference. You just don't have that yet. You will probably, in the end, have an Islamist party. I believe that'll happen in Sweden, if it's not already happened. It'll happen in many other countries.
Yeah.
So you will have fanatics. It just won't be Jews, but you will have religious fanatics who believe in Sharia law and all that. That's just bound to happen because of Muslim immigration. But that's the biggest difference, I would say. And then, of course, in Denmark and Norway and Sweden, yes, they do. All of them have their opinions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it's not what drives them. It's a footnote in their political views. They focus more on socioeconomics. Right now it's about the war in Ukraine. It's about the relationship with NATO. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is something that obviously they engage with whenever there's a war, but here it's a matter of life and death. So in Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is on one of the top levels of what the party the views are on this. So that's a big difference. But I think there are a lot of similarities in the sense that you have a lot of different parties. For example, the same in Denmark. You have some left-wingers, you have some right-wingers, centrists, you have capitalists, you have socialists. So many of those things are quite similar, actually. And the Labour Party, for example, in Israel, or what used to be a Labour Party, has a relationship with other Labour parties in Europe, in Denmark and Sweden and in Ireland and stuff. So in that sense, they do have many similarities.
With this ongoing situation with Israel and Hamas and this, how is this affecting people's lives in a daily life? Do Israelis, is this like a constant thing, you think? Or is this they live their normal life and try to...
Yeah, I don't think anything is normal here, but now that I'm looking out of my window, I'm seeing people on the beach, seeing people going about their day. That is normal life, but it's not normal compared to Denmark or Norway and Sweden, because the minute they leave the beach and they go back to the streets, they'll see posters of their fellow Israelis who are held hostage by a terrorist organization. And whenever they turn on the news, they will hear discussions and developments on the situation. Is the ceasefire going to last? Are we going to go to war again? So you can't escape that. Well, I guess you can if you don't turn on the news. But eventually, if there is a war again, you'll hear the siren. So it affects people's lives. But because Israel has been used to being in a state of emergency and war and alert since well before 1948, that's what people don't understand. It's not that in 1948, a bunch of Jews came and took over a country and then a war started. Not at all. Many, many years before that, you saw Arabs and Jews in what was then British Mandate Palestine slaughtering each other, killing each other. So it's something that Jews in Israel and later Israelis have just always been used to, that they need to be alert. And you can have your daily lives, you can go about it, but it's always like in the back of your head. It's always kind of like underneath the surface.
This conflict has it's not only been about bullets and bombs, but also propaganda and lies. And I have a big question for you. What would you say is the biggest lie that we in the West take as the truth?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Mm.
I would say most things that come from Hamas shouldn't even be reported. That being said, because Israel shut off the borders and didn't allow journalists to go in, they gave us no choice, which is horrible, because you're relying on a terrorist organization that systematically and deliberately lies about anything and everything, from how they treat their own people, to how they treat the hostages, to whether they fight in hospitals and schools and UN buildings. There are very, very few things that you can trust when it comes to what Hamas says. What you can trust is that when they send out a video of how they fight inside Gaza, which they do on their Telegram, that's real. So when some Hamas fighter is firing an RPG from a civilian home where there's a couch next to him, and he's firing at an Israeli tank, that's true. That's 100% true. Obviously, it's a propaganda video, but what you're seeing there is not something that's made up. This happened. So I'm astonished, unfortunately, that the West and the whole world is just repeating Hamas press releases as if they are true by saying Hamas says. Well, you might as well just say Al-Qaeda says. What's the difference? ISIS says that 2 people were killed and hit. Okay, what's the proof? Hamas is giving us casualty numbers. But when you give casualty numbers, you cannot say, we're not going to tell you who's a militant and who's not. When Israel is giving numbers, they say, this guy was killed in Gaza, he was a soldier, his name was this and that, he was 25 years old, he came from Herzliya, and when a civilian is killed, you say that it's a civilian. And when Hamas doesn't want you to know how many of their members have been killed, it's obviously because they want you to think that as many civilians as possible have been killed. That's the whole reason for the war. They want the world to think that Israel is slaughtering deliberately as many civilians as possible, and that Hamas is just basically an external factor that's not even incorporated into the war, which is, to me, is mind-blowing, because it's so obvious that they're definitely doing everything they can to manipulate with the numbers. One of the examples I have is when Hamas, for example, there's an airstrike happening in Gaza. Half an hour later, you have an official statement from the health ministry saying 83 people were killed. There's no place in the world, and especially not inside a war zone like Gaza, where rubble and there are no roads, and where you can have professional people coming to an airstrike aftermath and counting 83 casualties after half an hour. It is insane. And no other place in the world would you do that. I spoke to people who were in Iraq and Afghanistan. They said never was there any situation where there was an airstrike or they killed somebody, and then half an hour later the Taliban had like a statement saying, well, the US forces killed 84 people. That never happened. Sometimes it took weeks before they even knew how many people were killed. But in Gaza, they send it out because it will be repeated instantly. And I've been on the forefront of this from the beginning, working for many of the media and trying to tell some of my editors that it's not, we shouldn't just push out this number. Sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't, because they say, well, we don't have anything else to go by. And I think that that's just horrible, that we are forced to repeat numbers that are clearly exaggerated and inflated without any sort of proof, because it skews the whole understanding of the war.
Yeah, it's sometimes it's more important to be first and not to be right, isn't that?
Yeah, unfortunately.
And I was thinking about this too, about the Al-Shifa hospital. They immediately counted 500 dead, and that the hospital was bombed by IDF, and this whole thing. And this was not properly, if at all, corrected in the Norwegian media, that it was their own rocket and it hit the parking lot, and it was like minimum casualties and all this.
It was the Al-Ali hospital.
Al-Ali.
But I get why you confuse them, because there's so many hospitals in Gaza. But it was the Al-Ali hospital, and the fact that it wasn't a bigger story, that it was their own rockets that killed not 500 people, but somewhere around 50, as far as I could tell afterwards from the different numbers that were. The fact that that was not a major story is mind-blowing. That you have terrorist organizations firing rockets at civilians in Israel, but they fail and they kill their own civilians inside a hospital, and it's blamed on Israel. That in itself tells you everything you need to know about the dynamics of the war.
They killed people inside the hospital. Wasn't this in the parking lot?
It was in the parking lot, but I believe some of the shrapnel killed people who were basically on the, I guess it was the courtyard, but people who were also inside the building somehow. Somebody who was about to leave the building, or, you know, it was a horrible incident that killed innocent people. But again, Hamas was to blame 100% for that.
The situation with Hamas is now living its own life. We can say that we have the normalization starting with Lebanon. It seems the Houthis, we don't hear so much from them anymore, but we have the big one, Iran. Still, what would you say is the status between Israel and Iran right now?
I think Israel is very happy that, number one, President Trump is in office, and number two, Iran is weaker than it has been in decades. All of its proxies, from Hezbollah to Hamas and Islamic Jihad, the Houthis in Yemen, and most importantly, probably, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, all of them are either wiped out, gone, or significantly weakened, especially Hezbollah. That was the main deterrent that Iran had. That was the whole idea of being a tentacle, having tentacles around Israel, a ring of fire as they call it, where at any given moment Iran could press the button, activate all of these terror groups, and they would launch missiles from left and right all over Israel, which they did. And they killed many people. But they didn't succeed, which is quite extraordinary when you think about it. Ballistic missiles from Yemen, cruiser missiles and ballistic missiles from Iran itself, from Hezbollah, and of course all of the rockets from Gaza and Syria as well. That just did not go the way that Iran hoped it would. And now they're left very fragile, very exposed. Bashar al-Assad's air defense system is gone. Israel made sure to destroy that within the first couple of days after he fled Syria. Iran has also suffered heavy blows to its air defense systems by Israel. So essentially Israel has now a direct path from Israel to Iran if it wants to carry out heavy airstrikes against their nuclear program. But in order for them to do that successfully, they will need help from the United States, which they have the heavy bombs that can penetrate deep underground and destroy the nuclear facilities once and for all. Now, Trump has reached out to Khamenei, the supreme leader. He sent him a letter. He said he hopes he wants to negotiate over the nuclear program. Khamenei said, I'm not negotiating while you have a gun to my head, basically. Well, I'm not going to do that. Trump is running out of patience. Trump is a very impatient man. He's not going to allow Iran to stall for time and to go back and forth with messages. So I think that this year, I think 2025 will be the year where the US and Israel together join forces and destroy Iran's nuclear program. It's just a matter of time. I could obviously be wrong, but all things indicate that that's going to happen.
So this what's the name? The International Atomic Energy Agency.
Yeah.
IAEA. Vocals. They have said that they have 275 kilo uranium, 60% purity, and they can convert it to 90% purity and create from this 6 nuclear bombs. How secure? No, how airtight is this information? You think, or how sure are people that this is the way it goes? They're going to create nuclear weapons. Can this potential be like a mistake if they attack, or?
I don't think so, because it's not just the IAEA. It's US estimates, American estimates, Israel estimates. Many different countries have more or less the same kind of assessment of this, gathering intelligence. The IAEA has been there and they know pretty much what's happening. And Iran is also not hiding it. They continue to say that it's just for civilian purposes, but anyone who knows just a little bit about uranium enrichment and nuclear weapons know that you don't need 60% enriched uranium, and you don't need to have all of the things going on in their nuclear facilities that are currently going on. So it's clear to everyone that Iran wants to show the world that if we decide to develop nuclear weapons, it won't take very long. We have basically all we need. It won't take that much time. Now, there's a difference between getting to the 90% enrichment and to have a nuclear warhead, but also be able to put it on a ballistic missile. It's something that could take, some estimate it could take a year, some say 2 years. So there are two different things that you calculate with. Having the nuclear warhead, actually developing the bomb, and then being able to send it far away with a ballistic missile. Those two things are different. But I don't think at this point there's any question that Iran is absolutely a nuclear threshold state, and they want us to know that, because it's a deterrent in itself that they are very close to being a nuclear state.
You think that this will be a airstrike to take this out if this time come, or will it be like similar to this underground rocket facility in Syria, where they go and they blow up the doors, they go drive around with the like a mini, was it ATV?
Yeah.
Placing bombs. What do you think?
It's a good question, because the reason why Israel could do it in Syria at the time was, first of all, it's not that far from the border, and they could do it in the middle of the night. It was one location, or two locations relatively close to each other, and Syria at the time was very weak. The defense around there was very weak. Assad was extremely weak. Iran is different. I'm not sure that they would want to send actual soldiers on the ground in Iran, simply because it would be catastrophic if Iran managed to capture some of those soldiers and hold them hostage. Then you would have another hostage situation, not in Gaza, in Iran, which is a nightmare. If Gaza is a nightmare, Iran is a huge nightmare. I don't think that the Americans for sure won't. I don't think that Trump wants to send soldiers into Iran. Israel, you never know. But my guess is they will try to do as much as possible from the air. And even if they manage to destroy 80% of their nuclear facilities, it's still very successful and sets back their nuclear program years. So that's what I think we're going to see. A joint airstrike in many rounds all over Iran.
Yeah, now they don't have this anti-air defense systems anymore from the last Israeli attack, so they are vulnerable right now.
Very vulnerable. So, Iran still says that they have. I think it's a bit difficult for us to say with 100% certainty that there's no air defense systems left, because of course Israel would like to maybe exaggerate it a bit and say we destroyed everything. I'm not entirely sure that's the case, but either way, if the US and Israel decide to send their most vicious fighter jets into Iran, it'll be nearly impossible for them to stop it.
Where in Israel are you living?
I'm living in a place called Herzliya Pituach, which is a coastal city. It's not that far from Tel Aviv. It's a little bit north of Tel Aviv, but it's its own city, and it's a relatively quiet and nice area, and that's why I live here.
Yeah. Do you have any interesting cases you're working on right now?
Very much. I have one that I'm hoping is going to come out in the coming days. I've been working on it for weeks. It's a big story. I won't say too much because you never should, but it has to do with the ICC, and I believe that that's going to cause a lot of turmoil, and it will probably, I think it has the potential to do many things and have ripple effects. So hopefully that's going to come out soon.
And in what paper can we read that story?
So it will be in an American outlet. I won't go into which one because it's still lots of pieces that have to come together. But I'm really very much hoping it's going to come out soon, because I've been working so hard on it for a long time, and it's probably the biggest story that I've been working on myself to expose, in my career.
That is very exciting. I hope you can send me a link when it's out.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I want to say thank you for coming and speaking with us today. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you so much, Per. It was really, really interesting. I like those formats where we have time to talk, and you asked excellent questions and clearly know what you're talking about. So that's always a pleasure to speak to somebody who's knowledgeable.